Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into the show today. We have a very special guest, Professor Jorg Hülsmann. He's a professor of economics at the University of Angers in France, and he is also a fellow of the Mises Institute. He recently wrote a book called Abundance, Generosity, and the State, which deals with principles of charity, or as you call it in the book, Professor Hülsmann, gratuitous goods. So we're going to get to that. First, I want to ask you a little bit about your history, particularly how you got involved with economics and the Mises Institute.
I've studied mechanical engineering and economics. Was a double major program in Berlin, and then also in Toulouse. We had an exchange program with a French university, a French business school, in fact, in Toulouse. And right from the beginning, I've been very strongly interested in economics, which I didn't anticipate quite at the time when I signed up. And then, of course, in order to please my father, I finished the engineering degree, and he himself was also a false engineer, right? So he also was an engineer, then shifted over to the commercial side very quickly. I didn't go into commerce. I was not interested in sales or in management and so on, but I really loved economics and I loved philosophy. So that's what brought me then to do a PhD in economics. And at the very beginning of this, I had in preparation to this, by pure accident, I came across Austrian economics, and it was really not what I was looking for. But so here it was, and the very first book that I read at the beginning of my PhD studies, which was in monetary economics, was Ludwig von Mises's treatise on money, and that really won me over to the Austrian school. This was one of the most mind-blowing experiences in my life. It was completely different from anything that I had read until then. And I sense that it's a very philosophical, very deep, but also very realistic, very close to reality way of doing economic analysis. So you're not playing around with models. And that's what had interested me initially. So I like to play with the models. And then coming from engineering, all the mathematics and so on was not particularly difficult in economics. So that's what brought me in. But then I saw that this is actually much better and also more conclusive when it comes to practical decisions. So that's how I got to Austrian economics. And then, unfortunately, I was the only one really interested in my cohort in Austrian economics. All others were not. And my research director was rather skeptical. And so I had difficulties finding a job in academia in Germany. And then my wife at the time, so my girlfriend, she said, why don't you get in touch with some people who like what you're doing? So
good advice.
And those days there was no internet, but I came across by accident the laissez-faire book club. So there was this mailing list, right? So you got a quarterly leaflet with all the book advertisements, and you could order it from that book club, and they would send it to you across the Atlantic. So I bought I don't know how many dozens of books with laissez-faire books, and they also had advertisements of conferences. One of these conferences was organized by the Mises Institute in New York City, and that's how I got first in touch with the Austrian crowd. I was actually one of the last students to meet Murray Rothbard, who was the foremost economist at the Mises Institute at the time. And Rothbard, I had brought a copy of my German language doctoral dissertation with me. And he said, well, my German is kind of rusty, so why don't you send it to my friend, Hans Hermann Hoppe, who was a colleague of his at the University of Las Vegas. And so I did when I returned to Germany. And then on the very same day on which I heard of Rothbard's death, he died in early January 95, Hoppe gave me a call. So we talked on the phone. And so that's how I really got in touch with the Austrian crowd. And then, yeah, later on, I worked for the Mises Institute for a couple of years. And then before we would eventually return to Europe. And now I'm a professor at the University of Angers, as you have said, since 2004.
Wow. So you met some of the greats in person. One of the last to meet Murray Rothbard. That's amazing.
Yes. A very sweet person. So he took his time. Well, I actually made sure that I was the last person standing in line, right? At this conference, there was a huge line of people who wanted to talk to Rothbard or wanted him to sign one of his books and stuff like this. And my English at the time was not very good. So French was my first foreign language. And so I didn't understand much when he gave his talk. Well, first of all, I was not used to following English language talks, and then he also had this Mickey Mouse voice, and with a very strong, yeah, with a very strong New York accent. So I couldn't really follow much of his talk, but then he was very generous with his time, and he sat with me, and eventually the other people who were waiting for him for dinner sent somebody up and get him out of the room because he wouldn't show up. So he was just talking with me all the time. It was very, very fine, very wonderful experience. But I just met him this one evening, and yeah, but he still had a great impact in my life through this, but especially through his writings, of course.
Yes, that's really. Wait, so German and French, you're trilingual, German, French, and English?
Yes, yeah. I mean, of course, my German is best, but and my French is about as good as my English.
Wow, that's fantastic. So you met Murray Rothbard, read Mises and Hoppe, but then what made you focus specifically on studying and researching and writing about economics and generosity and charity?
Oh, this came much later. This was also was a pure accident. The initial reason was that well, I'm Catholic, and Pope Benedict XVI, he had published in 2009 an encyclical with the title "Charity in Truth." I mean, for non-Catholics, I should say, well, encyclical is not some sort of a summons or order or something like this. So it's more, it's a letter that he writes to, actually, it's always entitled to all the faithful and all people of goodwill. So it's not only addressed to Catholics. And the Pope always takes this literary form when he wants to point out what he thinks is a pressing problem and call people to reflect and to act. So that's really what it is. And he didn't have really a blueprint, but he felt that what he called the principle of gratuitousness is fundamental for human life. So the most important things come to us gratuitously. So as a gift, not necessarily as a gift. A gift is deliberate, right? I mean, God, of course, if he gives his love to all human beings, that's a gift, right? God wishes to give his love to all of us without expecting any sort of payment. But lots of other things that are gratuitous, and that's the topic of my book, right? So therefore I use the expression gratuitous goods, which is more general than talking about gifts or charity, right? In the case of gifts and charity, you intend to do something good to other people. That's not necessarily always the case when you provide gratuitous goods to other people. So anyway, so the Pope felt that the principle of gratuitousness, well, plays a role as far as basic spiritual goods are concerned, so love and friendship and so on, of course, the divine gifts, right, so the divine virtues, but also in the economy. And he felt that this role was increasingly being compressed, so it played ever less of a role. So people were growing indifferent, more cold-hearted. We had rugged individualism, we had dog-eat-dog competition and these things. So he said, well, I mean, this seems to be wrong. The economy seems to be out of balance, and the disequilibrium is increasing. What are the causes, and what can be done about this? So it was more call for reflection, call to action. Okay. I mean, it was not the first Pope who said something similar, but it was very interesting the way he presented his considerations, because, well, he was a very deep thinker, and so he established the connection with basic spiritual goods and the spiritual dimension, the connection between the material world and the spiritual world. So that was very interesting. But at the time, I didn't have time to dedicate to this question. So I asked first a doctoral student to do this. That's the great advantage that you have as a professor. You say, oh, so somebody else should do this, and I find it interesting. So, and I found just the perfect person to do this. And she was a Catholic sister, so a nun, and had prepared doctoral studies in Germany. She was from Africa, or she is from Africa, but she had, came with a scholarship of the Ratzinger Foundation. Now, Ratzinger is the civil name of Pope Benedict the 16th, right? So it's Joseph Ratzinger. And he had earned a lot of money with his books, and he didn't want to spend it on his vacations or cars or whatever. So he just wanted to reinvest this money for some meaningful projects. So he created a foundation. The foundation is the beneficiary to the present day of the selling receipts coming from his book, and they hand out scholarships and do other things of a similar nature. So she was a beneficiary of the scholarship and said, oh, okay, so this girl cannot be wholly stupid. So why don't we give her a chance? And of course, I met her before, and yeah, she made a very good impression. And then she set out and wrote a doctoral dissertation on this. Now, I mean, this was the work of a beginner, and her English was also not very good at the time, so she didn't really deal with the English language literature, but did a fine job bridging this or approaching this topic from the point of view of Austrian economics. And there was no other dissertation there dealing with this sort of topic. So it was original, and even if it didn't go very deep, it was a first draft and entirely sufficient for a work of this sort. And then a year later, I was invited to give the Lou Church lecture at the annual Austrian Scholars Conference in Auburn, Alabama. And this lecture is supposed to deal with topics at the intersection of religion and economics, or let's say faith and economics. So I chose this topic. Said, okay, I mean, there are more things to be said about this that she didn't go into. And there were two things that I felt needed to be dealt with in some more detail. One was the non-intentional providing of gratuitous good to others, right? So we've talked about gifts and charity, but there's also this non-intentional thing. If you do anything, you succeed in what you're doing, you're providing an example to other people. Now, it's not necessarily your intention that you would steer others, that you provide an example, but nevertheless you do, right? And especially if you succeed and you earn money, that's very interesting to others, right? So you will have lots of takers. But it's no less important if you fail, right? If you do something that other people might consider as well, but you fail more or less clearly, that's also precious for others, because it shows them that however you want to go about this, you probably shouldn't do it in exactly the same way as this guy did. And so that's the gratuitous good. And so you have, this is just one example, right? So and then and she gave one or two examples of this sort, and she hadn't really grasped the pervasiveness of this phenomenon. So I thought, well, we need to look into this in much more detail. Now, in my book, now I have a very large chapter. It's one of the largest chapters in the book. It's chapter 6, deals with these gratuitous goods that come in the way of side effects of the actions of other people. And the second large topic that she had somewhat neglected was the role of government interventionism. And here, especially, I mean, it's clear that the welfare state falls into this area, falls into this sphere, because the welfare state allegedly provides gratuitous goods to its beneficiaries. And to some extent, that's true, right? The welfare state does hand out goodies to other people. But now what is very interesting is that the consequences that follow from that sort of gratuitousness that comes from the state entails very different effects than private gratuitousness, private charity. Right? And that's what you see everywhere. Right? Usually private charities are really helping other people to improve their lives. Right? Usually they don't drive them into dependence, and they don't turn them into worse people than they would have been without that assistance. But that's what state-funded assistance always does. And it creates huge problems, and that's well known now in the US, and has been known for a long time. I mean, it's not something that's really new to our time. It has been known for centuries, right? But and So there are reasons for this, which I discuss in the book, which in that respect, my book is not very original. I mean, by and large, these reasons have been known for a long time. But there's one area of government interventions that has been neglected, and I think it plays a huge role as far as gratuitous goods are concerned, namely monetary intervention. And very few people have made the bridge between the presence and the activities of a central bank and charitable activities and the side effects of the market. And that's what I do in the book. So there I was really breaking new ground because this hadn't been dealt with elsewhere in the literature.
Okay, so I'm curious then, when you say monetary interventions, what exactly do you mean by that? Do you mean like the COVID stimulus, just handing out free money? Or what are we talking about?
Well, government intervention is a partial violation of private property rights. If people bond together in one way or another, in a purely voluntary setting, this is always based on the respect of an autonomous fear of others, right? You don't, if you want to cooperate with others, you don't slap them, right? Of course you can do, but that would no longer be voluntary, right? Then you become coercive because you don't respect the property that these others have in their own body, right? If you help yourself and you take the car of your neighbor without consent, that's not voluntary either, right? That's coercive. So that's not really cooperating. That's serving yourself at the expense of others. Now, the problem with governments is that it's always based on some sort of a partial violation of the property rights of others. And it starts with simple things like, well, government spends money. How does it get this money? Well, it's taxation, so it robs other people, or the government gets into debt. Well, why can the government get into debt? Well, because the people who lend it money know that the government can rob other people legitimately, and therefore has the ability to pay back and so on, right? So it's always the threat or the reality of expropriation, so violation of other people's property. The same thing. If the government regulates the economy, it's not like you would regulate your own company. You set up rules for employees and for all members of the organization, so on. So that's what we want to do because we want to accomplish these and that objectives. And then everybody adheres to it because everybody signs the contract, right? Everybody adheres to this, and so that's not coercive. That's voluntary, right? So it's a voluntary regulation. But when governments come into play, they regulate the rest of the economy without consent. So it's always, at the end of the day, it's at the point of a gun. You say, these are the rules that I wish you to obey. You might not agree with this. I don't care. If you don't respect them, well, I'll fine you. And if you go on, well, not only I will fine you, I'll put you in prison. Right? That's what it is at the end of the day. Now, that creates a tension that you don't have in a purely voluntary setting. Or at least it creates a greater tension than the one you would have in a purely voluntary setting. So you get certain consequences that follow from it, right? If people are coerced to obey certain rules that they have not consented to, well, they will try to steer around this, right? Or they will try to subtract their goods, that is themselves, their time and so on, but also the material goods from the influence of their government. And so it's all forms of evasion that take place, which you don't have in a private economy. So various consequences that follow from government intervening, and these are so the analysis of these consequences, that's what we do in the theory of interventionism. Now, monetary interventionism starts with with any order that the government gives. Well, you should use this type of money rather than this one, or I prohibit you from using these sort of coins or these sort of banknotes or something like this. Right? So it starts with simple interdictions.
So even just having a national currency, the
yes,
dollar, you have to use that. That's monetary.
That's the most visible thing that we have today, right? For example, in each Western country, we do have a central bank. The central bank is not a natural institution of a purely voluntary economy, because the central bank has been imposed by the state, right? So everybody is obliged to use the money that is being created by the central bank. All commercial banks are today obliged to have accounts with the central bank and to interact through the central bank and so on in part. right? So there's a lot of coercion involved as far as these things are concerned. And then, of course, central banks, and that's the other thing, is very visible, have the power to impose on the economy types of money that we would not have chosen voluntarily. Right? We use banknotes, so it's just paper. We use accounting money, right, or scriptural money. So we have accounts with bank accounts with the central bank and so on. And to some extent, of course, we would have used these things also in a voluntary setting, but now we are obliged to do it, right? And as a consequence, these things become much more preponderant than they would have been in a voluntary setting. And the motivation, why do they do this? Well, the motivation is ultimately a financial one, because of the presence of the central bank, because the central bank can create money that doesn't cost anything to create, right? If you write a few zeros on a banknote, you create $1,000 notes. If you create accounting money on the internet, or on your computer and so on, it doesn't really cost anything. But these money units that the central bank can create in this way, they still help to the authorities to spend money. Right? There's money that they can spend. So there's a very strong financial interest for the government. And that's why they have created, historically, why they have created central banks and why they're still promoting this sort of system.
So what effect does that then have on the gratuitous goods or on charitable giving of the government interfering in the money system?
Well, the most momentous consequence is probably that, I mean, in our system, the central banks intervene through the credit market, right? So when new money is being created, it always comes in the form of credit operation. Let me give you an example. So if a commercial bank needs an additional credit from the central bank, it addresses the central bank and says, here, we would like to have whatever $1 billion of credit, and the central bank then credits that amount of money on the account of the commercial bank, on the account that it holds with the central bank. And in exchange, it promises to reimburse this credit, this loan at some later point, 3 months down the road, 1 year down the road, doesn't matter, right? So the central bank, so to say, it purchases the promise of a future payment, and in exchange, it credits the account of the commercial bank right now with that sort of money. Okay. Now, because it occurs through the loan market, the consequence of money creation is always that the interest rate is lower than it would otherwise have been. Okay. Now, and that is very momentous, because a permanent decrease of the interest rate destroys the saturation mechanism of capital investments. And that's what I explain in my book. Oh, excuse me. That's what I explain in my book. If you have a free market economy and people become richer, right? So you have a growing economy, people become richer, they have more wealth, they have greater savings. Now, they can invest these savings. That's one possible use, but they can also spend these savings on their own private projects, build a swimming pool, purchase a larger house, I don't know what, or they can donate it to somebody else, right? So 3 main areas. And that decision depends, of course, mostly on the personality of the potential donor, but also on the economic context. And especially on what economists call the opportunity costs. So if you have the opportunity to invest money and earn a very high return on that investment, then your incentive to donate that money is very low, right? So if I have, let's say I have $1 million on hand that I don't need for my private life, so I can either invest it or I can donate it, and by investing it, I can earn 10%. Well, then the incentive to donate it is not very strong. So I might still donate some, but not that much, right? Whereas if I only earn, let's say, 1% or so, then of course the incentive to donate a larger sum becomes greater, because I wouldn't earn anyway much with this money, it would just lay around. So I can also put it to some use that will benefit other people. Now, in a economy without much government intervention, there is the tendency for the interest rate, so for the return on capital, to diminish. Because if people become ever richer, if the savings increase, then these savings become less scarce. Right? And so that's the basic law in economics, that if something becomes scarce, it becomes precious. Right? And if it becomes less scarce, well, it loses in value. So if savings lose in value, well, they tend to be less remunerated. The return on savings diminishes. Therefore, the opportunity cost of donating money diminishes. Right? And also, you would spend less time thinking about investment projects and so on, because it's not worth a while, right? 1%, that's not really interesting. So you wouldn't spend much time. So you have more time to use for other things. Visit your family, visit sick people, visit handicapped people, and so on. Help out, volunteer in your neighborhood, and I don't know what. Right? So you have more time to spend because the opportunity costs are lower. Now, what central banks do by diminishing the interest rate on the loan market is that they actually facilitate the leveraging of investments, and therefore the amount of money that private investors can earn by still investing their money. Let me give you a numerical example. Let's say you have this, so you have this $1 million, and the central bank loans money at 2%. Okay, and you have the possibility, let's say, to so the central bank by and large let's say they give this money away, right, to make it simple, right? So you can get it at 0%, can get a loan. And you have on the market, you can invest this money for 2%. So you earn 2%. So that doesn't seem to be much. But if you obtain money for zero cost at the central bank, right, and it doesn't matter that it be zero. What matters is that it be much below the market rate at which you can invest. That's the crucial thing. And that's what central banks always do. So if you can loan out money at a much lower rate, then you can earn a lot of money, even though the market return on investment is low. Okay, now I come back to my example, right? So you can invest $1 million in a project, and you would earn, let's say, only 2%, so $20,000. Right? But now let's say you can fund that $1 million by taking a loan from the central bank for $950,000 at 0%, and you bring in just $50,000 of your own money. Okay, so then you invest 1 million and you earn 20,000, but the 20,000 is all for you. So in fact, what you have earned now is 40% on a 50,000 investment. It's an extreme example, right? Because in practice, of course, you wouldn't get the money for exactly zero from the central bank. I mean, we have had this in the past, and central banks have actually also had negative interest rates. That's even worse, right? But it doesn't matter. The crucial thing is, if they lend at rates that are lower than the rate at which you can invest, right, then that creates very strong incentives for people to stay invested, even though the return on investment that they earn on markets is very low, right? So the opportunity cost for giving dramatically increases. And that goes for a long way to explain why, I mean, if central banks go down this road with great determination, right, they fund the market with cheap money and so on, they tend to increase the opportunity cost for giving, and therefore people become more stingy. They become more stingy with their money, but they also become more stingy with their time, because suddenly it becomes interesting, right? Even though the absolute amount of money that you earn is not very much, but relative to the amount that you invest yourself, it increases. So that becomes now worthwhile your time. And I took the example with 50,000. Yeah, but there are some people who own 5 million. And if they can take out a loan of 50 million or 60 million from a bank that grants them a credit at very low interest rates, and they have the possibility to invest at slightly higher interest rates, well, then they suddenly start spending a lot of time thinking over, oh, where do I best invest this money? And so they have less time for all other things in life. And that's the culture that central banks have created. So that's the world we've been living in for several decades now.
So I restate it to make sure I've got it. The central banks manipulate the interest rates they of course say that this isn't the point of doing it, but the effect that it has is to tend to make saving money. Wait, we're rephrasing. it tends to make the giving away of money more expensive than saving the money and trying to, well, no, sorry. I think I've got it, but I'm not sure how
You have to
clearly it
renounce
goes.
to more, right? Because look, if you have 50,000 and you're giving 50,000 away, okay, so what's your opportunity cost? All the good things that you could do with 50,000. But if you can earn 20% of 50,000, then in fact, what you're giving away is not just 50,000, you're giving away 60,000.
Because you're giving away
Right?
that, but also you're losing what you could have gotten in interest. But if
Exactly.
the interest rate is very low, then that doesn't really matter that much. I can
Yeah.
get
If the now more precisely, if the return on your investments is low, then it doesn't matter, right? So then whether you invested or not, you would have 50,000 in one case and 51,000 in the other case. It's not really that much important, right? But if the return that you can earn on your investment is considerable, then you would hesitate. You wouldn't give away. You wouldn't donate as much as in a setting in which no intervention had taken place.
and by manipulating the interest rates, they make it more profitable to invest the money instead of doing
Yes,
something else with it.
yes, right. So this is the basic mechanism, and this is reinforced through something that in finance we call bailing out a debtor. Right? Central banks always bail out the commercial banks, and they always bail out the political authorities. And they do this because they want to prevent that the whole house of cards of a debt finance economy implodes. Right? If you have one person who is very strongly indebted, that person goes bust because well, he's unable to repay his debt. Well, that's too bad for him, so he goes bankrupt, and everything that he owns is then well taken over by his creditors, right? So other people come to own his house, his car, and so on, and he starts anew. He rebuilds his life, becomes an employee somewhere, and so on. And by and large, it just concerns him. It's not a social problem. But if everybody is in debt, and if I go bust and you are my creditor, and you're yourself very strongly indebted, right? If I cannot repay you, then you cannot repay your creditors, right? So there is a cascading effect, a snowball effect that results from this. And therefore, central banks, because they know this, they want to extinguish the fire that could potentially result from such a snowballing effect. They want to extinguish the fire while it's still small. So therefore, whenever somebody is in difficulty who could potentially create a snowball effect on the whole economy, they hand him out new credits. And if the central bank is not sufficient to do it, they ask the government to also step in and privatize or socialize some of that business and so on. Now, right, that helps preventing the crisis, but of course, it reinforces the problem.
Yeah, it's like it's just pushing it off for now. It's not really
Yeah,
fixing the problem. Yeah.
you see, if there were no bailouts, I took the example before, you bring 50,000 of your own money, you take out a credit of 950,000. That's a hypothetical example. It's not very likely that something of this would take place. I mean, some people would do it, but most people wouldn't, because it's just too risky to owe that much money and you don't know what could go wrong, right? So few people would actually do it. But if you know Big Brother Central Bank is behind you, and if something goes wrong, well, you get an extension of your loan, or you get a new loan with low interest rates, or you get a subsidy from the state. Well, why shouldn't you do it? You would be almost stupid to do it, not to do it. Right? That's the problem that we have today. We have a lot of cheap money plus bailout policies.
But it sounds like this is kind of like a mirror, maybe a different effect of the classic Austrian business cycle theory. But instead of looking at booms and busts in the economy, you're looking at the other effects that it have on how people choose to use their money and what they choose to do with it.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Was that effect of the business cycle, was that the most interesting thing you found, most startling thing while you were doing the research for the book? Or was there something more momentous?
No, I've been aware of this effect for a while. I alluded to this in other book publication. I mentioned it briefly in The Ethics of Money Production, which was first published in 2008. But I mean, it's just a short paragraph, right? And so unless you read the book very carefully, I mean, and you would hope over this, right? If it comes on page 265 or so, I mean, it's one of the many points that you make. Yeah, okay, it's interesting, yes. And then you go on. So here in this book, I explain this mechanism in much more detail, right? So at the time, it was really only financial professionals, by and large, or people who were really into Austrian economics who caught up on this. But so here now in the new book, it's presented in much more detail, right? So that people see what is really the mechanism is at stake. No, I would say the thing that most surprised me was the reason for which economists typically downplay the side effect benefits of a market economy. So this is this chapter 6, in which I talk about all the gratuitous goods that are provided to others unintentionally, right? So in standard economics, the positive side effects of human action on other people, right? They're called positive externalities in economics. And in standard economics, such positive side effects are considered to be a market failure. Hold your breath, right? So if you do something and other people benefit from it,
it's supposed to be a good thing.
yeah, I mentioned that if you succeed in your business, that's a positive side effect for others because they see an example of doing business that works and they don't have to pay for this. Right? Same thing, if you screw up with your investment, that's also an example for others, and they know, well, I shouldn't do it exactly the same way. That's also a gratuitous example, right? And then various other things, right? I mean, in Austrian economics, we've talked about what I call in the book cultural commons, right? Like language. Nobody has created language. Language is something that evolves spontaneously under the contributions of millions and billions of people who use that language and slightly change it, ever so slightly changes every single day, right? So if all, I mean, without going to this, so nobody creates a language. Language is something that is spontaneously created and provides benefits for all people who use it, even though nobody has paid for it and nobody has really deliberately created the language. And other Austrian economists have famously shown that the same thing holds true for a juridical system, something like law. Law historically has evolved spontaneously. And so it's the same thing, right? A system of rules and so on benefits all members of the community, even though nobody might have created the system of rules in its totality, and nobody has to pay for that. And the same thing again, right? In the absence of state intervention, you have a monetary system that evolves spontaneously. Historically, money has emerged out of individual exchanges, and people have then zoomed in on using the same medium of exchange in all exchanges and so on. Nobody has deliberately created this. Nobody has paid for using a monetary system, but still it is there. It springs from individual action, right? So these are examples that have been well known. And then in the book, I discuss also various price externalities. Right? If you have competition, right, you provide better service. So you provide a good under better conditions. Your customers don't have to pay as much than they had to pay previously. Now, that extra benefit, of course, you're providing it intentionally, right? But in a way, of course, it's not something that you do gladly, right? But something that you do in order to get the deal yourself, not to leave the market to your competitor, right? So the customer is benefiting from something that is the consequence of competition. So an improvement is a consequence of competition, not of any act of charity on the side of the agent, right, of the firm, of the entrepreneur. So the market is full of these things. And in standard economics, these things are considered to be market failures because, right, you are producing goods in excess of what you're being paid for. Therefore, you are underpaid. And because you're underpaid, you're not producing as much as you would if you had been paid fully for each good that you produce.
Do you think that, from what I understand about economics. They mostly focus specifically on the exchange of money, or the exchange of money for goods and services. So do you think because of that focus, they overlooked this obviously good thing or considered it a negative thing because it fit outside what they were considering classic economic activity?
You asked me what was the most interesting thing that I learned. And I said, well, it relates to these side effects, right? To these externalities. Because, and that's what I learned, that's what I understood. And really, the whole conception is built on a very old theory that had been articulated by Aristotle in the fourth century before Christ. Right? Aristotle says in his book, the Nicomachean Ethics, that in a just exchange, everybody gives the exact value that he receives. So if I go to the bakery and I pay $1 for bread, then if this is a just exchange, the bread has exactly the same value as the dollar.
Mm.
And unless I give the exact equivalent of what I receive, the exchange is not just. Okay.
I can understand that, but
Yeah.
better
I mean,
than just.
it's not, of course, we're used to this sort of reasoning, right? And of course, the rest follows from it, because it means that if you're providing goods and you're not being paid for this, well, that's not just. It's not a good state of affairs, right? Or if you're receiving stuff from others and you're not paying for it, that's not just, right? That's the fundamental conviction underlying this neoclassical theory of externalities. In fact, it says the market is functioning efficiently only if all services that are provided to others, and which are not deliberate gifts, are also compensated.
So they're treating it very much, it sounds like an algebraic equation or mathematical equation where you have to give exactly this and then get exactly this, and then it all
Yeah.
evens out, and then it's okay.
Yes. Yeah, in a way that's true. Yeah. And then of course you run into various problems, various practical problems, right? Because the basic question is always, well, how do you know what the value is of any good, right? And let's say I exchange apples against pears, right? How do I know how many apples are worth one pear?
That's true. And that could change on the person. If someone really, really likes
Yeah.
pears and the
Yeah.
other person just
I
thinks
mean,
they're
apples and pears are different, right? They're not the same thing. They don't, I mean, they have some certain things in common. They're fruit in both cases, but other than that, I mean, they're also different. So how can you say one is equal to the other? It makes no sense. It's really literally comparing apples to pears, so things that are not the same, and you cannot completely equate them. It's just not possible. And the same difficulty you have this also in the case of money. Money is different from apples. So if you give so and so many dollars for a pound of apples, you still cannot know. I mean, per se, these things are different. You cannot say that one is equal in some sense to the other. They become through the exchange. When I say yes, the people who exchange them, they agree that this is equal value. But even that's incorrect, right? That's how people have reasoned until the 18th century, and still there's some people today who argue this way or think that way, but from a scientific point of view, it's wrong. And economists starting from the 18th century, they've pointed out that when people exchange, actually they disagree on the value. If you go to the bakery and you buy the bread, you pay $1 for the bread, then for you, the bread has more value, more personal value for you than the dollar that you give. And for the baker, it's the other way around. He prefers your dollar to the bread, which is not surprising because he has the entire shop full of bread and he doesn't need all the bread, right? So he wants to get rid of it. Of course, the dollar is for him more valuable than the bread. And that's the principle at bottom in all exchanges. Whenever we exchange, it's never value equality that motivates the exchange. It's always the difference in value. And people actually disagree, right? For each one, you receive something that has for you a higher value than the thing that you give. And of course, sometimes we err, right? We make a mistake and so on. That's different. But from the outset, we always try to get something that's for us a higher value than the thing that we give, right? And in exchange, people disagree on what the right value of the things is, right? So with Aristotle's theory, really, we do not get very far. And the amazing thing is that the theory has survived in the microeconomic theory of externalities. And that, for me, this was a stupendous discovery, that this theory ultimately relies on this very old Aristotelian conception of just exchange. Um,
I wouldn't have, I would never have known that, would never have thought of that because I had heard of that before, oh, it's got to be precisely this, everything's got to be just, but to think
yeah,
of it in that way and trace it back to Aristotle, especially, that's really
yeah,
neat.
yeah.
So would you say that's one of the most important insights that people can glean from the book, this different way of
I'm not
thinking
sure
about it?
for most people. I mean, it's economists would probably be also be interested very much at this point. I mean, for most people, I think it should be interesting. Two things should be interesting. Um, uh, the I mean, this is another thing that I also personally found very interesting. Um, gratuitous goods are really bound up with a social order which is based on private property rights. There, where you don't have private property, there is some limitation of what you owe to others and what you can claim from others. That's what private property serves us to do. It delimits the stakes, right? It says, you can go until here, but no further, right? And if people claim something for you, yeah, in some cases it's justified because you owe, and in other cases you don't owe, right? So there is a difference between owing, not owing, claiming, not owing, having the right to claim, not having no right to claim, right? And that is fundamental for gratuitous goods, because so in the case of a gift, this has been known for centuries. You find it in St. Thomas Aquinas and all modern writers who've been pronouncing themselves on this question. You can give only what belongs to you, right? If I give something, well, that presupposes that this other person has no right to claim that thing, right? If I have a $10 note and give it to somebody, saying that I give it to this other person means, well, the other person didn't have a right to claim it from me, right? Maybe I'd stolen it from him. In that case, it wouldn't be a gift, it would be a restitution, right? Robin Hood, if he robs the rich king, right, and gives the money to the poor, he's not really making a donation, he's making a restitution, right? He's returning money to the people from whom it has been stolen, right? So, right, so the point is, whenever we make a gift, whenever we receive a gift, it presupposes that there be a limitation somewhere to what we can claim and to what we owe, which means in the opposite, that in whatever social setting you have in which there are no such limitations, in which there are no private property rights of any sort, in which you don't even own yourself, in such a situation, then everybody might have potentially a claim on all other things, on the services of all other people, on the property of all. I mean, there is no property, right? And all the things that are around. In such a setting, you cannot make a gift. It becomes conceptually impossible. There's also a practical impossibility. And that was the discovery at the beginning of the 20th century of Malinowski and other anthropologists who had studied primitive tribes in some Pacific islands. And they found that, well, they don't know the concept of a gift as we know it. Right? So these people, they only say, well, everybody somehow has a claim on all other things. So it's a give and take. And it's all bound up in a process ruled by custom and so on, which says, well, yes, you can claim and you owe, and there are no limitations. In such a scenario, there is no gift. There cannot be any gift. And that's, in fact, what sociologists, especially the French sociologist Marcel Mauss, Mauss, what he argued in the 1920s, right? He said, well, in a famous book that has the title Essay on Gifts, donation, I think it's Essay on Gift in English. He argued, well, strictly speaking, there's no such thing as a gift, and there should not be such a thing as a gift. And the reason is that Marcel Mauss was a socialist. Right? So, in fact, he was a communist deep down. So he thought there should be no private property. And clearly, if there is no private property, you're lacking the essential tool to distinguish mine from thine, and therefore also distinguish obligations from non-obligation, right? And so then everything is up for grabs. Everything is in principle owed to everybody, and you can have no more gifts. And of course, you could have no more gratuitous side effects. Something that is gratuitous just impossible in such a setting. And that's another. I think this should be interesting for many people, that they take consciousness, right? That we, I mean, these things that we call generosity, charity, and so on, In fact, they're premised on our civilization as we know it. And that civilization, well, which has different roots. Some come from the Roman Empire, some come from the Bible, and they all admonish us to respect the property of other people, right? Thou shalt not desire what belongs to others. So it presupposes the concept of the limitations of rights and obligations. It presupposes private property. And that's actually the fundamental condition for generosity and all things that make social life beautiful, right? And if you don't have it, I mean, it's just dog eats dog. Mm-hmm. It's just everybody's just rushing to grab as much as possible.
And it sounds too, maybe I'm taking this a leap too far, but it sounds like all these gratuitous effects that you're describing are part of what allows an economy to grow and thrive. And those are all based on people's private property and the decisions that they can make with that. So yes. Would it be a stretch too far to say that without those limits of private property, there couldn't be the gratuitous goods, and therefore an economy could not grow or would not be as likely to grow?
Yeah, that's a good way. I don't think you could go so far and say it couldn't grow at all. But I mean, the kind of growth that you would get would be purely material growth. So then you would have a general tendency to just do the accounts all the time. And you just want to make sure that that the bottom line is in your favor, and you're counting all the time. And you could then, because I mean, if there's no gratuitous goods, then you're paid for all services that you receive and so on, right? So you always have to balance. Whereas we are still used to, well, we are doing certain things because it's the right thing to do. It's true, other people benefit from it, but so be it. I mean, we don't care, right? We cultivate our garden because we like flowers and so on. We want to make life beautiful for our children. Okay, passers-by, they benefit from it as well. Say, wow, that's a beautiful garden. And they might take even inspiration for their own garden from it and so on. But that's not of concern to us, that other people might benefit from it as well. In fact, it might give us pleasure as well, or maybe not. But we wouldn't do it. We would do it anyway, right? Whether it benefits others or not. And all these things, yes, if you have no private property, and if thanks to state interventionism, everything is really paid, all goods that are provided to others are remunerated, then, well, that reduces your outlook. You become more stingy, right? It's actually a quite wretched existence if you think of it, right? If you really have to count every single item. Oh, do I lose on this? Do I earn on it? You ask yourself that question every single instance. That's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like going back to that Aristotelian, trying to make sure that every exchange is exactly just, and counting out every little thing you might get or that the person might get, and making sure you get paid for it.
Yeah,
that's horrible.
Yes, yeah, I think it really is. Yeah.
So it sounds like what your book is dealing with is kind of the juncture between economics and humanity and culture and society, and all of these things coming together in a way that makes human life much better for everyone.
Exactly. And so what the book shows, I mean, that there are very powerful economic mechanisms at work that entail precisely an abundance of such side effect goods, right? Not only if you have a thriving economy with economic growth and so on, that's a good thing. That's great for donations, for all sorts of charity. But it also entails a great number of side effect goods, right? So externalities, they're not remunerated, and that become part of life, right? And so each one of them might be tiny, but in the aggregate, right? If you're bathing in an environment of this sort, which people are, I mean, constantly providing goods to others, marginal, but without looking to be paid, that creates abundance, as a spontaneous abundance. And if you inverse this, and government interventions, unfortunately, have the tendency to inverse this, right? That very often think of monopolies, right? Governments impose a monopoly. The monopoly serves to privatize some of the benefits that through competition would spontaneously go to other people, for which they wouldn't have to pay. What the monopoly does is to make sure that, well, most of the benefits actually come to the producer, who is in the only position to sell it and can prevent others from doing it. And intellectual property rights have very similar effects, right? We prevent other people from doing, from imitating you in the first instance, but also then more fundamentally coming up with similar ideas, maybe the same idea, and just putting it into practice. That's the terrible thing, right? All human progress is based on imitation, right? Children babble like their parents, and then they behave, they walk like their parents, and so on. They greet others like their parents, they solve conflicts like their parents. If we're not allowed to imitate other people, I mean, where would we go? I mean, this is just impossible. It's a matter of impossibility, right? And so if we're doing this right now, it's not that general, but we're preventing people from imitating others in certain fields. Well, that's good for those who are protected in that way. But for humanity as a whole, it's a bad thing if you can no longer imitate, if you can no longer imitate what works, freely imitate what works.
And changing gears a little bit, bringing it back to you personally,
Yeah.
this seems it seems to me that the way all of it is set up is just beautiful and amazing, that by going about human economic activity freely, you actually make things better for everyone. It reminds me of the invisible hand, Adam Smith. Now, as a man of faith, did this kind of strengthen your faith, seeing how everything just kind of works as humans just working naturally, that God maybe set it up that way, or is it just
Yeah, oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, somebody asked me a similar question. Would I be against government intervention, or would I be in favor that it create more gratuitous goods? Well, probably I would still be against government intervention because it's unjust, right? If you rob others, that's not a good thing. Even if you do good out of this, and it's also not biblical, right? This is so I would not have liked it anyway. But in the present case, or what you see if you follow the economic analysis, you see that there's no trade-off to be made, right? It's not that we have to play justice against the great consequences that follow from government interventionism. It is actually the inverse, right? Not only it is unjust, but it also creates terrible consequences, especially for the sphere of gratuitous goods. And you can show this then if government intervention increases, it hurts the markets, of course. So it hurts for-profit activities through regulation and taxation. But it hurts the gratuitous sphere even more, right? Because if you hurt the market, you diminish the revenues that spring from it, so people can give less. But at the same time, monetary intervention in particular also reduces the motivation to give, right? So government intervention always diminishes the gratuitous sphere more strongly than the market. Right? So it is actually, it works in both effects work in the same direction, right? So, and that definitely is a wonderful thing to see, what God intended us to be, namely free people. And we pray this in our Christian prayers all the time, right? Liberate me. The truth will make you free, and things like this. And so we see that what God intended us to be, and be free and prosperous and generous, and these things hold together.
Now, we've been talking about some pretty high level economic stuff here. Bringing it back down to the ground, what are some concrete things that people can actually do about the ideas that are presented in the book?
Well, I mean, practically speaking, I would say the most important thing and that's really all you can expect from an economics book, is that you become skeptical about government interventionism, right? You shouldn't call, if you wish the economy to become more generous, less selfish, and so on, you wouldn't call for more interventions. You wouldn't call for an extension of the welfare state. You wouldn't hope that the central bank will improve things for you. And these are the most practical things that you can take away from this book as a citizen, right? Don't play with the devil. Don't expect that by calling for governments to be more involved, you will actually improve the humane side of society and of the economy. It will do the exact opposite. And otherwise, I mean, we are all part of the system that has been imposed on us, right? We are all part of the monetary system in the US, in Europe, and so on. So, and as human beings, of course, we need to take care of our families. Right? So the incentives that I've described, there was not a moral condemnation when I say, well, people have an incentive to invest every last penny rather than giving it away. Well, we are subject to the same incentives. Right? So I'm not waving my fingers and I'll be, oh, you are bad people because you do this. All I say is, well, be aware of this, right? It comes from there. It's not something that's inherent in the market. It comes from the monetary system. Now you have to deal with this in one way or another. So you have to deal with your family. So it's still a moral decision. Right? I'm not there to tell you what you have to do. I can explain you what are the causes of the incentives that you face and of the trade-offs that you have to make, but it's still your personal decision. Everybody is dealing with this differently. So I have really no practical advice to offer there. It's a very personal thing. I say the only practical thing is, again, is your attitude toward government interventionism. You should have no delusions there at all. And actually, I think the most important thing is to get rid of the central bank. Right? So there, I'm fully on the same page as Ron Paul in the United States. I think he's doing a great service to his fellow citizens, pointing this out. I mean, you need to lead the campaign against the central bank.
I think even being awoken to that fact, because this is something that most people wouldn't even think of. They would just, oh,
Yes.
this is money and we just use it. And yeah, the government makes it. And they wouldn't even think about an alternate point of view. And like you say, question, should things really be this way? So
Yeah.
I think that is an amazing part of the book. Again, it's Abundance, covering the A, Abundance, Generosity, and the State by Professor Hülsmann. Is there any last thing you want to talk about before we sign off?
No, from my side, it's good. I congratulate you on the important work that you are doing with voluntarism in action. So I looked this up a bit. Yeah, so this is wonderful that this still exists. And again, the cards are stacked against you guys and against all others who are trying to do this kind of work. But it's ultimately very, very important, of course, not only for the beneficiaries of your voluntarism, but also for all others who might benefit from this activity as a side effect, right? As they see, okay, yeah, there are things that we can do, and here's how we can do it. Responsibly, with love, but also, yeah, especially responsibly.
Well, thank
So
you
thank
very
you to
much,
you too.
Professor Hülsmann. And I'm going to put a link in the description of the video if people want to buy the book over on Mises.org, their store. You can go ahead and do that. I did. Started reading it already. It's pretty good. But thank you
Thank
very,
you,
very
sir.
much. And I hope you have a great day. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like what we do here, please like, share, subscribe, comment, and go over to our website where you can offer donations, request help us help people who are in need voluntarily. And we'll see you next time.